because when we came up with this idea of creative convergence, no one seemed to personify it more than James Williamson. Here's someone who pretty much transformed rock and roll without even knowing it in the 70s, pretty much developing the chord sequences for punk rock, speed metal, alternative music, and everything that came after that, and then deciding to become an engineer, moving to Silicon Valley, leading a quiet life in Saratoga for 30 years, never talking about it, and then coming back to take a few victory laps and rejoin the band. It's one of the coolest stories ever. I've had such a kick writing about James's life story, because it's really just one of the amazing stories. One of the most amazing stories I've seen in 30 years as a journalist here in Silicon Valley. And today's a very special day. This is the homecoming. After a brilliant world tour that's taken the Stooges to Korea, to Europe, and now he's back here with us. So I really want to thank James for making time for us today to be part of this history-making event, and also Jack Boulware for agreeing to moderate this discussion. Jack is a longtime journalist in San Francisco. He wrote a column for the SF Weekly for many years. He wrote a great book, Give Me Something Better: The Profound, Progressive, and Occasionally Pointless History of Bay Area Punk from Dead Kennedys, the band that Mr. Joe Biafra, who's here today, started, to Green Day. Give Me Something Better. And the other thing I just wanted to say is that there'll be some posters for sale in the lobby. Shepard Fairey, the famous poster artist who did Obama's Hope poster, did a commemorative poster commemorating this very important day here in San Jose. And James has signed some copies of that for all of you, so they'll be out there in the lobby if you want to purchase one. And one more thing, Jack is the executive director of Litquake, an organization that promotes literature and authors in San Francisco. So without further ado, Jack, why don't you take it away from here?
Thank you, Dan. Welcome, everybody. We'll try to get done as soon as we can so you can see The Fugitive from Belize. We'll keep it short. We're coming right after us, so hang tight. Can we see the first slide? Can we advance to the second slide? James, who is this guy?
Well, that picture was taken actually down in Padre Island, Texas.
How old were you at that time?
I was probably, I'd say 16 or 17. I think that was maybe around 1964, 65, something like that.
That's pretty long hair for 64, 65.
Yeah.
And long hair sort of got you in trouble, didn't it?
Especially down there.
They might have even called you a goddamn hippie, I think probably was the language of the time.
Yeah, well, you know, I was just reacting to the times more than anything else. You know, that was kind of the time when, you know, Bob Dylan was around, and you had, you know, the Beatles just starting to break in the U.S. and so, you know, it was cool to have long hair, but it was also very troublesome for me as a kid in Michigan in particular, because they weren't having any of it. And so I ended up first getting kicked off the basketball team, and then
for your hair.
For my hair.
Right.
And then I got kicked out of school, and so I asked what any good Bob Dylan fan would ask, which is, what would Bob Dylan do in this situation? And he, you know, I just basically told him to pound sand, and of course that made me truant, and I ended up in front of the judge for truancy, and ended up going to juvie as a result of that. So long and the short is, I learned very quickly that you don't want to fight City Hall, because the first thing they did was cut my hair off. And so it's good lesson for me.
So did you pick up any criminal tips while you were in juvie?
I found out what real delinquents are like.
Did they teach you how to make a shiv or anything like that?
Well, no, but they were, there's a lot of different stories in the big city for sure.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. So you had been a musician for a long time already by the time this photo was taken, and your buddies were that formed this band called the Stooges in Ann Arbor, and you knew the guys in the band, and you saw their early shows.
Yeah.
So, and what was that experience like?
Well, when this photo was taken, I had already, been in a couple bands. One I formed called The Chosen Few, co-formed rather with the singer, and that band later, kind of after juvenile home, I went to New York City to a boarding school, and when I came home for vacation, that band had added a new bass player, and I went up to Ann Arbor, Michigan to see him. And that was Ron Ashton. And so that's the first time I met him. It was a frat party, and Iggy was also there. And this is before the Stooges. And so we were kind of fast friends from there, and the relationship continued from there. And so by the time this picture was taken, I'm visiting Texas in this picture from Michigan. And so by the time that picture's taken, I was well into knowing those guys. And when they first started their band, the Stooges, it was just in a little house in Ann Arbor, and they used to practice in the basement. But Ronnie, the bass player who I had met as a bass player, was actually the only guy that knew anything about music. Iggy was a drummer, but he wanted to be a singer. And the rest of them couldn't play at all. And so they kind of just lived in that house and played all the time. And eventually they got proficient enough to do shows. And there was a very popular place in Detroit called the Grandy Ballroom. And they played their first show, I think as an opening act for the MC5, or I forget exactly, but I went to it. And their show, they named themselves the Psychedelic Stooges originally. And their show consisted of Iggy on an osterizer, a blender with a microphone, and then also on the vacuum cleaner. And so that was his instruments, and as well as, kind of John Cage kind of noises. And the drummer got two big, 20-gallon steel drums with mallets, and that was the drums. And then, of course, you have the bass player and the guitar player playing against that. So it was pretty wild stuff, and certainly not for everyone, but there was a fair amount of drug usage at the Grandy Ballroom. And so it all worked, together. Iggy, I remember, shaved his eyebrows and wore glitter and silver face for that, and he learned that night why we have eyebrows.
But yet, they went over pretty well. They had a cult following.
Yeah.
You would say a cult following.
Yeah, they were something to behold, really. I mean, I was impressed that they could pull that off, let's put it that way.
Right to the top of the charts. So they did 2 albums, the Stooges, and after 2 albums, you are asked to join the band, and you join the band. Can we see the next slide? This is you with Iggy,
yeah,
as part of the Stooges. Was it pretty exciting to join this band that obviously had a regional following at the time?
Yeah, well, like I said, they were my buddies too, and so it was kind of natural more than anything else. I mean, I moved to Ann Arbor, and I was living with some of the guys already in a house, and they asked me because they had started adding a rhythm guitar, and the guy that they were using was actually not a guitar player. He was the roadie, but they wanted him anyway, but he didn't turn out to be much of a guitar player, so it was kind of something that everybody agreed was probably the right thing to do. And at first, yes, it was great, you know, because these guys I could just drop into a band that was already playing, you know, decent sized rooms and stuff. And so for me, it was really cool, but at the point that I joined the band, it was kind of already falling apart because drugs had entered the picture, and so, you know, people were not, the band was not very reliable, and we essentially self-destructed within, you know, 6 or 8 months.
So that was your big break in rock and roll. That lasted 6 months.
That was it, and from there, I was actually got sick with hepatitis, and so we broke up the band. I went back to Detroit, and I was sleeping on my sister's couch, and so until I got over that. And meanwhile, Iggy got a deal with CBS in New York, and so the next call I get is well, you know, pack your stuff up. We're leaving for London tomorrow. And so I'm like going, well, sister's couch, London, you know, and so why not? and so that's that. I'm kind of leading up to this picture because once we were in London, we kind of got parachuted into the ground zero of glam, if you will. You know, it was David Bowie's management, and you know, T-Rex was going on over there, and we're, you know, here we are, a couple of bumpkins from Detroit, never been out of the country before, and it was quite a shock for us, really. But we knew what we wanted to do, and so very shortly we brought the Ashton brothers over, moved Ronnie over to bass, and we reformed the Stooges as Iggy and the Stooges. And so that's the kind of the Mach 2 of the whole thing.
Right, right. And this is, you're working on the Raw Power album in
Yes.
London, writing the songs there. So it's not songs that you wrote and then went to London to record.
Right.
You kind of created it there in London.
Right, we did, you know, we did bring over some songs which we played at a live show, the only one we ever did there. But then we wrote new songs for the album Raw Power. And so when we were finished over there, we came back, and this was taken at Como Hall in Detroit. And it was our only show that we played under that management around Raw Power. And I guess for those of you who don't know this story, I'll repeat it. Those boots that I have.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what's up with those boots?
Well, those boots, you know, we were living in Hollywood at the time, so we got hooked up with some, you know, people that made, you know, custom clothes, and we had, and I went to a custom boot maker and had him make up these wild boots, and he, you know, I didn't give him enough time to do it properly, so he got started on it, but they were only ready almost like the week before the show. And if you notice those boots, they come up half the way up the thigh. And so I learned there's a reason why women's boots have give in the knee. And so what I found out was I had these boots and I was stuck with them, but I couldn't sit down. And so I was really screwed. And so when we did the show that night, they had to actually just lay me down in the back. And then when I had to get out, they would pick me up. And I couldn't sit down the whole night until the show was over. So it's, I only wore those boots one time.
That's hilarious. So the record that you created, or the Raw Power, I mean, today it's considered a classic proto-punk album. All these musicians have said it's inspired them. Johnny Marr, the Smiths, Kurt Cobain, the Chili Peppers, Henry Rollins, Morrissey, Motley Crue, Guns N' Roses. I mean, everybody in rock and roll knows that record. But at the time, let's just review who your songwriting contemporaries were on the Billboard charts for February of 1973. There's Crocodile Rock, Elton John. There's Rocky Mountain High by John Denver, and Killing Me Softly with his song. So faced with that sort of audience that was listening and digesting music at the time, how did this album, Raw Power, sort of go over with the public?
Like a rock. Like a rock. I mean, the thing about Raw Power is that it was an album that the management that we had did not, well, they didn't know we were doing it at first, but everything that was Stooge that we brought over and did for demos, they rejected. And really the only reason Raw Power was ever made the way it was made was because David Bowie became very popular and started breaking in the US. And that management group had their hands full dealing with his stuff, which was actually paying the bills. And they left us alone without any adult supervision. So we got to do, what we wanted to do. And that's what came out of it. But it was nothing that any producer or anybody who was cognizant of what works or sells would ever let you do.
So as you're touring this record, I think we talked before, and you mentioned the tour for this. You referred to it across the U.S. as a death march.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
what do you mean by that? Just describe that a little bit.
What happened was that the album flopped for many different reasons. We parted company with the management team, main man, and then we hooked up with another management team, which was a guy named Jeff Wald, who was also Helen Reddy's husband, and also a pretty famous manager, actually. And anyway, what they did initially for us was just put us on the road. So we played constantly across the country. Actually, what I call the Death March was after that management team, we had yet another one, and those guys just moved us across the country, hand to mouth, every single, instant that they could get a show for us. So that's a pretty brutal existence, and it kind of was a death march.
And so after that, you ended up in Los Angeles.
We were at that time in LA.
In LA.
Yes.
And during this time, I think you mentioned before, this is when you met the woman who would be your wife. But how did you meet initially?
Well, that manager, Jeff Wald, hired some people to actually deal with us. And one of those people was a friend of my wife. They had gone back to the old days in New York with Albert Grossman and all that kind of stuff. And he became our road manager, a guy named Chris Aaron. And so we were playing a week, I think, at the Whiskey A Go-Go in LA, in Hollywood. And Chris kept wanting to introduce my wife to me. So one night I'm upstairs backstage and getting ready, and Chris brings her up, and
what does she see? What is she confronted with?
Well, her first introduction to me is sitting there with my hair sticking straight up in the air, 5 different colors, and makeup, And so, she's kind of a little taken aback, but doesn't say much, She worked for Warner Records, so she'd seen it all. But then it falls out of the closet, and stuff is happening. And
he was just hanging out in the closet there?
Well, we won't go into that. Anyway, so then it's time to go on stage, and at the Whiskey there's a big covered ramp going onto the stage from upstairs down, and so we hit the ramp, and Iggy's got to go to the bathroom, so he just lets it fly all the way down the ramp, and so my wife this is her first experience with me, and it took me 7 years to get her to go out with me after that.
You had to promise no Iggy, no urinating.
Yeah, we were post Iggy by then.
So you and Iggy eventually started working on a record together, which would be called Kill City.
Right.
But this was, it sounds like it was a tough situation to sort of make this record, to keep all the balls moving. To talk about that just a little bit.
Yeah, you know, it was in the middle of yet another Stooges breakup. You know, after the Death March, we all kind of had it. You know, we ended up with a very famous show at the Michigan Palace called, that was recorded as Metallic KO, and people throwing bottles and
light bulbs,
cameras, light bulbs. You know, it was actually a bunch of bikers, but that's a whole side background story. Once that was done, we kind of had it, and so we regrouped in Hollywood, and we were going to try to make another record, or try to do some demos for another record, and that resulted in Kill City. The thing was that what we were doing, you know, recording on a cassette machine and stuff wasn't going to cut it. So we had a very good friend from Cream Magazine named Ben Edmonds, who was in Los Angeles at the time, and he arranged with his buddy Jimmy Webb, you know, Wichita Linesman and all those songs, you know, MacArthur's Park, you know, just a fabulous songwriter who had he was quite successful, and he had a studio, you know, on his property, and he promised, or he told Ben, yeah, sure, you know, bring him in, but the only thing is I want you to use my brother as the engineer, and by the way, what he charges is a bag of weed every day. And so that's how we made that record.
Just bags of weed every day. It's been written about before, and I think you've talked about this before too, that Iggy was actually in a hospital while you were making these recordings, and you would actually have to drive him to and from the hospital to come and do the vocals?
Yeah, that whole previous tour had sort of made, you know, made a sort of, had a terrible effect on him, and so he was dealing with that, trying to get himself together, and it was, you know, it was good for him to come and do his vocals on that one. So we went back and forth, and ended up doing a pretty good job. If you've ever heard that album, I think it's a wonderful album. Quite proud of it. Well, one person I did Anyways, it's small vignettes is what it is, so it's kind of like a book of short stories, and it's you know, quite, I think it's quite interesting for that reason. But funny, while we were making it, Art Garfunkel came in one day with Jimmy Webb, and you know, they're listening to this stuff and they're going, really? You know?
It's a little different.
A little different, yeah.
Right. So, can we see the next slide? Kill City was delayed as a release.
Right.
So in the interim, you started working as a producer, as a recording producer at a studio, right?
No, not quite yet. No, I take that back. I actually did get a job as an audio engineer.
Audio engineer.
This is later. So I learned a little bit about the studio by doing that. And the only problem that I found with being an audio engineer is that you know, it's really difficult to play music in a band with guys you don't like. And it's even worse to record bands you don't like every single day, you know, and so it makes it really tough.
So you had to actually work at engineer records? On
disco records and stuff.
Disco records?
Yeah, yeah.
What sort of, any records we might have been familiar with?
No, you know, that day and age, it was like factory. You know, everybody was trying to write disco hits.
Just cranking them out, those 12-inch, right.
And so, no, I didn't, it just wasn't cut out for that. And so this picture was taken when I produced one of Iggy's solo albums, which by now he was solo, and it's called New Values. And so that's me behind the console when we did that.
So when you're starting to do these disco records before this happens, that's kind of a point of reckoning, I think, for a lot of people in rock and roll. I don't know, you're probably still a young man at this point. You know, what do you do? Now what is your next step? Do you play in bar bands? Do you just drink yourself to death? Do you, maybe you have a mental change of heart and become a disco kingpin? You could have done that.
Well,
what were your options there?
You're making a good point, because that is a critical time in my life, which was that by working in a recording studio, I started being exposed to a lot of electronics. And so I got to know a thing or two, and one day I was in an electronics store, and I happened across this dad and his kid who were, you know, booting up this box, and it was actually an MSI 8080. I don't know how many of you guys remember those things, but it was one of the very first personal computers, and you had to boot it up with front panel switches, and it would come up to BASIC. And so I'm looking at these two, and I'm going, what the hell is this? You know, because we, you know, had no concept about things like personal computers then, and so, but I thought it was extremely cool, and that actually changed my life. So I from there, you know, found out a little bit more about it and so on, and I kind of got struck by the whole excitement of the personal computer. You know, hadn't seen anything like that, and now I'm thinking, well, you know, rock and roll is not so exciting to me anymore, but this shit really is. And so, so that's how I started, you know, going to engineering school.
Right. So, so as you're going to engineering school, how do you make the transition from a late night rock and roll vampire to becoming like a student who actually has to read books and study?
Yeah. Well, that was. As they say, quite an existential gap. At first it was really hard for me, because I hadn't been a particularly attentive student in high school. In fact, I went to 5 high schools, and so I didn't have all the tools I needed to do this. But I did have an aptitude, as it turns out, and so that was useful. And I just really wanted it, and so I made it happen. But it was a real struggle, and I think it's kind of a testament to the university I went to you know, make sure I was successful at it.
So the university is?
It's Cal Poly Pomona.
Right, and I believe they have just elected you to their Hall of Fame. Is that correct?
Yes, in fact they did, and we're going to go down in February for that ceremony, because it's their first one. Their first. I'm not the first one, but this is the first year they're doing that. And while I don't really know what I did to, you know, to deserve that, I'm extremely honored that they would do that, and of course I accepted right away.
And you were pretty much, it's a given. You're the first Stooge to ever receive those honors.
I may be the first person ever, period. I don't know of any rock and roller that's in those 2 era categories. I mean, there are a couple, like Brian May, I think, is an astrophysicist, so that, you know, from Queen, you know, and so that's not bad.
but he's not here today. So in 1982, I believe it was, you moved to Silicon Valley here, and you got a job at Advanced Micro Devices,
Yes.
AMD. You're coming from this Hollywood environment. What is it like to come to Silicon Valley in 1982, given your background?
It was different. You know, first of all, this valley was so different then. I mean, those of you who were here then, of course, know what I'm talking about. But I mean, I hate to say this, but the first impression was we're driving up from LA. We just had our first child is now 1 year old. He's here today, and my wife Linda. Her first comment was, God, this is like urban sprawl, because every building was one story, and it was kind of, nondescript, but it was still farm country, really. I mean, there was, when we first moved to Sunnyvale and then to Cupertino, but where Apple is in Cupertino on Stevens Creek, it was a grain shed. And so it was an entirely different place. So we came up here, and the good news was that I could work at a very exciting company. In those days, AMD was extremely diverse, with many different types of products, from PBXs to mini computers and communications devices, and you name it, they were making it. And so in my role there, I got exposed to all kinds of really exciting technology, and I learned, I learned this back in the Stooges, but I reinforced the rule, which is, unless you are one, always get a good front man. And certainly Iggy fits that bill, and Jerry Sanders fits that bill.
Jerry Sanders was the head of AMD.
Yes,
at the time.
at that time.
Yeah. What kind of person was he? Was he an Iggy of the Silicon Valley?
Yeah, you could put it that way. I mean, he wasn't. Yeah, he kind of was. I mean, he was a very bigger than life guy, and he had the people who worked at AMD were very loyal to him for many different reasons. But he made an environment where the employees of AMD could really prosper. So it was a great place to start out, a great place to learn, and I stayed there a very long time and have many good friends from there.
I think you mentioned also that Jerry Sanders would throw these big rock and roll parties.
Yeah.
Where all the employees could come and hear all these rock bands play. Yeah,
he would, Moscone Center every year at Christmas time, the big AMD Christmas parties, and yeah, he would have all these bands like Earth, Wind and Fire and Rick Springfield, and all these guys would be playing at the party. And I didn't always agree with his taste, but he was, those were fun parties.
Could we see the next slide, please? So. You and your wife are raising a family here in Silicon Valley, and you get a job at Sony, and you're working. I guess you started up something called a Standards Organization for the Americas.
Yeah.
Now, what does that entail? Just for those of us idiots who don't know what that means.
Well, to begin with, standards work is very arcane, so I'm not going to be able to do a very good job of that. But I will say, standards are kind of the language of trade. So if you're working at a high-tech company, the most important thing for you, as we found out with Betamax, is that you need to interoperate with other people's stuff. And if you don't, then the market's not large enough for a large corporation to prosper, so the product's going to fail. And so standards become a huge part of a company's strategy to work with other companies so that without violating antitrust, I might add, in order to make a standard that by which if everybody follows it, then your products interoperate. So that's important role, and it's a role that covers a lot of territory, and it allowed me to work with all of the business units at Sony, which was fascinating. And Sony is such a diverse company, and so that experience, I felt was invaluable, and really it has had a great influence on me, to this day, really.
So at this time, you're working at AMD and Sony both, and that adds up to over 30 years that you've been in the Valley, but yet nobody really knew that you had once been the guitarist for the Stooges, and you'd written songs with titles like Your Pretty Face is Going to Hell.
Which we're going to do tonight.
So, during all this time, you essentially really didn't play guitar at all. You never thought about, maybe I'll start a band with these guys over at Intel or Fujitsu, or didn't even cross your mind?
No, I didn't. I was done with music, and I was having a good time doing what I was doing. So I was pretty fat, dumb, and happy. And the only thing was that towards the end, I happened to go to a flea market one day, and I ran across this really old guitar, and I didn't quite know what it was, but it sounded fantastic, and the guy selling it really didn't know what it was either. And so I lucked out, and I got this guitar kind of for a song, as they say. And it turns out it was made by a guy named Herman Weisenborn, who was a famous luthier out of Los Angeles, who is best known for his Hawaiian lap steel guitars, but really all the instruments that he made were fantastic. And this thing was so compelling to me that I started playing it a little bit. So I was playing just maybe the last year and a half before I actually, got the call from Ig about Ronnie.
Right. So Ron Ashton, the guitarist and bass player for the Stooges, is found dead of a heart attack.
Yeah.
And Iggy calls you here in Silicon Valley. And what happened? What happened with that phone call?
Well, the first time he called, it was just to tell me that Ronnie had died, and to tell me what was happening with the funeral, and all those sorts of things. And we got to talking. It's funny, but how these things sort of put things into perspective. And so we had been estranged from each other for 30 years. We really hadn't talked except for the odd, publishing call or something like that. So anyway, after a few of those conversations, he asked me, you want to play guitar for the Stooges again? And I told him, no. But it wasn't for the reason you might think. It was because I didn't really know if I could play the guitar. 30 years without playing, it's not, playing with the Stooges is a blind sport. You gotta play good, and you gotta play fast and furious, and you can't screw up, and if you do, all hell's going to break loose. And so the prospect of doing that at this point, I mean, here I am, I'm like 59 years old at that time. And I'm going, really?
That's a lot of work. It
sounds
sounds
like a lot of work. But coincidentally, Sony, not being immune to this economy, was starting to offer everybody over 50 early retirement packages, because they want to push people out, because they want to, cut their costs and do all the things companies need to do. So I was looking at that because it was a very attractive offer anyway. And so finally, when I had decided to take the package, I called it back, and it just felt like, well, we went back so far together into our 20s, I kind of owed it to him. So So I said,
so
yes.
you call him. You call him back out of the. He's not expecting your call.
Well, I forget who called who, but anyway, the next time we talked after that had happened, I said, you know, let's do it. So.
And what was his reaction?
Okay. But I still didn't know if I could do it. So then luckily I had 6 months to woodshed and get going. I also had the benefit of some friends, local friends here who offered me to rehearse with their band. The band was called Careless Hearts. And then they also offered me, which, you know, you can't play by yourself all the time. It's like sex, you know. So you know, you got to play live too. And so they offered to play a live gig with me too, and so we played at the Blank Club in 2009, and it was a lot of fun. And then from there, we had all the Stooges rehearsals, and we ramped up to our first show in Sao Paulo, Brazil, which was, you know, for 40,000 people. And so, like, I'm going from, you know, biggest show I ever played was 2,000 maybe, and it was just a whole different level. But I don't regret having done it. We've had a lot of fun the last 4 years, and you know, we continue to. We'll be there tonight for anybody who's interested.
Yeah.
We have the next slide, please. There we go. Live on stage with the Stooges again after how many years?
Oh, I think the last live show we did was 1975-ish, something like that. Yeah.
So what's the difference between playing and touring with the Stooges in the 70s and playing and touring with the Stooges in the 2000s?
It's just unbelievable. I mean, in the 70s, well, first of all, we were terrible entertainers. And so not only had our albums, you know, not sold, so, but we actually were ADD, you know. I mean, we didn't want to play the same songs all the time, so we kept writing new songs. And we played all the new songs every night and not the album songs, which is what we were supposed to be doing. And so then nobody ever knew what they were hearing. It was always the first time. And so it was like, well, let's just say that the shows were still interesting, but people had no idea what to expect. And the difference today is we play massive audiences. You know, I think the biggest one we ever played, now we played a lot of festivals, but the biggest one I think we played is like 300,000 people, and those are enormous audiences. And the thing is that the whole front is packed with people in their 20s, and they're, you know, they know the lyrics. So, you know, I mean, even to the new album that we just did last year, I mean, it's wild. So you know, who would have thought it? You know, we're in our 60s now. You know, I mean, why are we even doing this?
You see the next slide, please. So is it non-stop sex and drugs with the Stooges now?
Well, only sort of. What is it, gabapentin or something? You know.
So are your Silicon Valley friends jealous that instead of your like retirement plan being a ridiculous sports car or endless rounds of golf or whatever it is, that you're like in Berlin and, you know, Korea, like playing guitar solos in front of screaming fans?
Well, I don't know. I think I get the impression that they're happy I'm doing it, but they're glad they're not doing it. You know?
It is a lot of work. So one of the pinnacles of being a rock musician in America is that eventually you're honored with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, certainly.
Yeah.
The Stooges were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a few years ago.
Yeah.
About time.
And that was one of the few times, one of the first times people had seen you in public as a member of the rock and roll community in many years.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it was a great honor, and we actually, that was the Stooges' 7th time to be nominated. And the thing about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is that there's a committee that are kind of like, you know, cooler, and they know stuff. And so the committee had nominated us 7 times, but then there's a larger body that has to vote on you. And so 7 years in a row, till 6, this was the 7th, they went, you know, there was other people on the ballot that they liked better. And so finally, in 2010, we got in, and you know, we were either going to have to get in, or we were going to have to take pride in not getting in. And so luckily we got in.
All right. So after you were inducted, the Stooges played, and the first song you played was Search and Destroy.
Yeah.
Do you want to maybe talk, we only have a few minutes,
but
yeah. I think you want to talk a little bit about that. That's an iconic Stooges song that you wrote.
I do, yeah. Yeah, I co-wrote this with Iggy. I wrote the music, and I thought that for those of you who, everybody know Search and Destroy?
Yeah.
I thought that I would kind of deconstruct this song for you, if you will. Because it you know, in starting to try to explain it, a lot of things occurred to me that I hadn't thought of before. I mean, obviously, nobody is without influences in music. And, I mean, there's the chromatic scale, it only has 12 notes in it, you know, and that's the basis of almost all Western music. And the basis of all the music that I do, the pentatonic scale, only has 9 notes. So, you're bound to repeat some. And in fact, you're bound to repeat other people's some. So it's all differentiated by maybe just a little bit of rhythm here and there, or maybe just a little different nuance. So the genesis of Search and Destroy was actually, it was during the Vietnam War time. And one day at band practice, I started goofing around and just kind of going, machine gun, you know, from the Vietnam War. And so everybody kind of liked that. And I took it home, and, you know, this became like, you know, kind of, right? You know, that was the machine gun, you know, turned into music. So, so that's fine, and then I started thinking about it a little more, and actually that riff is not all that different from another riff, which is, you know, that's, Walk, don't run. So I'm going, okay, well, you know, I had listened to a lot of surf music, so I'm sure it was imprinted somewhere there, but I really had no conscious, you know, sort of influence from that, I guess. But then I thought I'd take it a little bit further, and, you know, if I think about the beginning of Search and Destroy, it's, right? Well, yeah. That's like, let's jump into Jack Flash, right? So that's I'm kind of going, okay, well, I didn't have any conscious, you know, as they'd say, nicking of that song, but I guess I must have. But again, I only had 9 notes to work with. So then I really found the ultimate insult, which is that actually the rhythm of the song is right, and you know, it turns out that that's a conga line dance. So it's like, right? It's the bunny hop. And so here it is. So the anthem of punk rock is based on the bunny hop.
I think we've all learned a little more about the bunny hop. Destroyed today. Do we have any time? No. Time for just maybe one question? One question. There's a microphone in the center. If anyone has one question.
How does it feel to be awesome?
How does it feel to be awesome?
Is that person related to you?
Excellent,
excellent.
No one that I know would ask that question. Well, thank you. I don't feel that awesome every day, but I have all my wife and kids to remind me of that.
Yeah.
All right. And just so you know, James has also been honored by the bobblehead community. So if you press this button, I think it actually plays a song, doesn't it?
It plays, as with any company, they don't want to pay any copyright. And so what they did was they got a recording from a live show of me kind of doing some nondescript thing, which is actually part of the solo in Raw Power, and they put that in there. So unless you really are a Stooges fan, you may not recognize what comes out of that bobblehead, but it doesn't matter.
All right, thank you very much, James Williamson, for this.